How do you stay quiet when you come home early, hear your wife promise she's pregnant by her boss, and plan to leave you for a real family, and then realize the only way to survive is to let her believe you heard nothing at all? My name is Adrian, and I used to believe surprise meant flowers, not silence. I left work early that Tuesday because the day had been dragging, and because I wanted to walk into our home like a better version of myself. I imagined her smile first, then the sound of her feet on the hallway wood, then the quick little kiss she gave when she thought nobody was watching. I even pictured the small lie I would tell about traffic, just to make the surprise feel earned. I parked 2 streets over because our driveway was visible from the kitchen window, and Marla had the sharp eyes of someone who always noticed patterns. I carried a paper bag with a pastry box inside, the kind she liked, because I still believed in details back then, and I still believed details could buy peace. The sky was low and gray, and the air smelled like damp concrete, and my shoes made no noise on the porch boards because I stepped the way you step when you do not want a dog to bark. We did not have a dog, but old habits do not need reasons to survive. The key slid into the lock without resistance, and that should have felt normal, but it didn't. The house was too quiet for a weekday afternoon, the kind of quiet that tells you someone is home and trying to stay invisible. I opened the door slowly, holding the pastry bag close to my body so it wouldn't rustle, and I stepped inside with my shoulders relaxed, because I wasn't hunting a secret, I was delivering sugar. The living room blinds were half closed, and the light that leaked through made thin stripes across the carpet like a cheap prison set. Marla's voice came from the kitchen, low and tight, the kind she used when she was pretending to be calm. I paused without thinking, because I recognized that tone the way you recognize smoke before you see fire. Her words weren't meant for me, and that was the first warning. I moved 1 step forward and heard the soft tap of a spoon against a mug, then the faint hum of the microwave clock, then her voice again, clearer now, shaped around private certainty. She wasn't laughing, and she wasn't whispering, and that meant she felt safe. She said she was pregnant by Victor, and she said it like she was stating a weather report, like the fact was already done and the only question left was what jacket to wear. She said she couldn't keep pretending because she wanted a real family, and she used that phrase with an ugly simplicity that made my stomach tighten. I did not hear my name at first, but I heard the space where my name belonged, like an empty chair at a table everyone else had agreed to ignore. She said she would leave me soon, and she said she had a plan, and she said Victor was ready, and she said she was tired of living small. My hand tightened on the pastry bag until the paper creased and the box inside shifted. I stood in my own entryway with my shoes on, holding dessert like an idiot, while my wife announced my replacement to someone who sounded like a close friend. The friend made a sound on the other end of the line, something like concern mixed with excitement, and Marla responded in a sharper tone, as if she had been waiting for permission to be cruel. She said, I would be fine, because I was stable, and she said stable like it was an insult. She said Victor was different, because Victor understood ambition, and Victor wanted a legacy, and Victor had the kind of life she deserved. She didn't say love, and that was the second warning. She was building a career story with a baby as the headline, and I was the footnote. I should tell you I confronted her right then, because that is what people do in movies and bad advice columns. I should tell you I stormed into the kitchen and demanded answers, and she cried and we fought, and the truth spilled like wine on a white rug. But I didn't do any of that, because I have never trusted the version of myself that speaks first. I have watched too many men talk themselves into cages, and I have cleaned up too many messes caused by one loud moment. So I did the only thing that felt clean, and I did it without drama. I turned my wrists slowly, eased the front door back open, and stepped out as quietly as I had stepped in. I pulled the door shut until the latch caught with a soft click, and I stood on the porch for a beat, holding my breath like the air itself might betray me. My heart was racing, but my face stayed still, because anger is loud and I needed silence. I walked to my car without looking back at the windows, because looking back would have turned this into a scene, and I refused to give it that dignity. I got in, set the pastry box in the passenger seat like it was evidence, and started the engine with steady hands that did not feel like mine. I drove to a grocery store parking lot and sat there with the windows up, watching people push carts and live normal lives. The bag smelled sweet, and it made me nauseous. I stared at the steering wheel and listened to my own breathing until it slowed, because the first thing you learn when your world tilts is that panic makes you stupid. I needed to be smart, and I needed to be boring, and I needed to stay in control while she believed she still had it. By the time I drove back to work, I had already made a decision that felt colder than I expected. I would not give her the gift of a private confession, and I would not give Victor the chance to frame me as unstable. I work in a world where stories get people fired and facts get people paid, and I have always preferred facts. If Marla wanted to leave, she could leave, but she would not rewrite me as the villain on the way out. I thought about Victor, and I pictured him the way I had seen him at company events, smiling like he owned the air, shaking hands like he was blessing people. He was the kind of man who wore confidence like a tailored suit, and he used policy words to cover appetite. I had never liked him, but I had also never taken him seriously, because I believed my marriage was not a market. That belief died in a quiet kitchen while I held pastries. That evening, I came home at the usual time, carrying nothing, wearing the same face I always wore. Marla greeted me with a bright voice and a practiced smile, and I watched her carefully as she pretended the day had been ordinary. She asked about work, and I answered in simple sentences, because the less I said, the more space she had to fill with her own assumptions. She moved around the kitchen with energy that now looked like rehearsal, opening cabinets, closing them, pouring water, wiping a counter that was already clean. I saw her phone on the table, face down, like it was tired of lying. When she looked away, I noticed the slight tremor in her hand, and I wondered if she felt guilt or only excitement. She told me she had been busy, and she said a friend had called her earlier, and she laughed in a way that sounded too light for the weight she was carrying. I nodded like a man who believed in weather reports, and I felt something inside me go quiet, a part of me that used to rush to repair. Over the next days, Marla became both careful and sloppy, which is what happens when someone is trying to juggle two worlds without dropping a plate. She cooked more than usual, as if food could buy forgiveness she did not plan to ask for. She initiated small touches, a hand on my shoulder, a quick kiss on my cheek, the kind of gestures that look loving from a distance but feel transactional up close. She also started leaving the room to take calls, and she started using her phone face down more often, and she started saying she was tired at strange hours. I didn't confront her, and I didn't accuse her, and that confused her, because people like Marla expect resistance. Resistance is something they can label, twist, and sell. Silence is a mirror, and mirrors make liars uncomfortable. I began to write things down, not because I wanted to live like a paranoid man, but because I wanted a timeline that did not depend on memory. I noted the day I came home early. I noted the time the microwave clock hummed, because it anchored the moment. I noted the words real family because they were the knife, and knives leave marks even when you do not bleed right away. I wrote it all on paper, signed it, and placed it in an envelope in a drawer I used for boring documents. I did not do it to feel powerful, and I did not do it to punish her. I did it because if she was planning to replace me, she was also planning to replace the story of me, and stories are easier to kill when they are still young. 2 weeks after the call, Marla brought up the subject of future planning over dinner, casually, like she was discussing paint colors. She asked what I thought about moving or changing jobs or taking a break, and her eyes watched my face the way a gambler watches a dealer's hands. I told her I thought stability was valuable, and I said it with a calm I did not feel. She smiled, and said stability could also be a trap, and she laughed like she had made a clever joke. I nodded again, and I realized she was testing the ground, checking for cracks, seeing how much truth she could pour in without flooding the room. When she went to the bathroom, I sat alone with my plate and stared at the empty chair across from me, the chair that suddenly felt like it belonged to a stranger who hadn't arrived yet. In the third week, she started talking about Victor more often, but never directly. She mentioned the company, the leadership, the way some people understood vision, and she said it like she was rehearsing admiration without naming the object. She also began to complain about my calm, calling it distance, calling it coldness, calling it emotional absence. The irony was thick enough to choke on, because she wanted to leave me for a man who measured people like expenses, and she was calling me cold because I refused to scream. I listened, and I let her talk, and I gave her nothing she could hold up as proof of my wrongdoing. Every time she pushed, I gave her a neutral answer, because neutrality frustrates manipulation. Deep down, something darker was forming, not rage, but clarity, and clarity does not need volume. Then, on a Friday night when she thought I was asleep, I felt the mattress shift as she got out of bed quietly. I kept my breathing slow and steady, and I listened to her footsteps move down the hall. The bathroom light did not turn on, and that meant she wasn't brushing her teeth. I heard the soft click of our front door, and I heard nothing after that. And I stayed still, because I was not going to become the man sneaking around his own home. 10 minutes later, I heard the door again, and I heard her return to bed like a thief who believed the house belonged to her. She slipped under the covers and lay still, and I realized she was practicing a new kind of freedom, the kind that depends on you being blind. I didn't sleep that night, but I also didn't move. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the phone call I overheard, and I thought about the way she said pregnant like it was a strategy. I thought about Victor's smile at company events, and I thought about the way Marla's voice had changed when she believed no one could hear. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, I accepted a final brutal truth. The betrayal wasn't the affair, and it wasn't even the baby claim, because those were just actions. The betrayal was that she had already written my ending, and she had written it without my consent. When morning came, she rolled over and kissed my shoulder like everything was normal, and I almost admired the audacity, because it takes a special kind of confidence to lie while someone is awake. I went to the kitchen, poured coffee, and watched the steam curl up like a question. Marla stood behind me, humming softly, and I realized she had no idea what I had heard, and she had no idea what I had started building. She thought the danger was discovery, and she believed she could manage that with charm. She didn't understand that discovery was only the first step, and that the real danger was documentation. I looked at the clock above the stove and memorized the time, because time was the only friend in the room that did not lie. Then my phone buzzed with a notification, and I saw her eyes flick toward it too quickly, and I knew the next piece of this puzzle was about to fall into my hands, whether she liked it or not. The buzz of my phone felt louder than it should have, like the house itself had leaned in to listen. I was standing at the counter with my coffee, pretending to scroll through the weather, while Marla moved behind me with that careful brightness she had perfected. She didn't ask what the notification was, because asking would have meant admitting she was tracking my reactions. Instead, she let silence stretch and filled it with small domestic noises, a cabinet door closing, a spoon tapping ceramic, a drawer sliding shut. I glanced down at the screen and saw a lock screen preview from our shared family tablet, the one we used for recipes and streaming, the one she treated like harmless furniture. The preview wasn't a message I had asked for, and that mattered, because accidents have better credibility than confessions. It showed a name, Victor Lang, and a line of text cut off mid-sentence, something about needing to finalize and before Monday. It was the kind of language that could belong to business or betrayal, which meant it belonged to both. I didn't react, And I didn't turn around, and I didn't let my shoulders tighten the way they wanted to. I finished my sip, set the mug down, and unlocked my phone with the slow patience of a man who had learned that speed makes mistakes. Then I did the simplest thing possible, the thing nobody can later accuse of being invasive. I took a screenshot of the notification preview that had appeared on my own screen. That was it, just one clean image with a timestamp, saved by the device that belonged to me. No passwords guessed, no snooping, no late-night spying, no dramatic rummaging through drawers. If Marla ever tried to paint me as paranoid, I wanted the kind of proof that came from a doorway, not a locked room. Marla drifted closer, her presence warm at my back, her voice casual when she finally spoke. She asked if everything was okay, and she asked it with the tone people use when they already know the answer and want to watch you lie. I told her it was just a message from work, and I said it like I was bored by it because boredom is the safest mask. She let out a small laugh that sounded like relief, and she kissed the side of my neck as if affection could erase suspicion. The touch didn't soften me, but it did clarify something important. She was still trying to manage me, which meant she still thought management would work. When she left for her early meeting, she dressed too carefully for a normal day, the kind of careful that feels like armor. She checked her reflection 3 times, adjusted her hair twice, and sprayed perfume in a way that made the hallway smell like something expensive trying too hard. She kissed me goodbye, then paused as if she considered saying more, and I could almost see the calculation behind her eyes. She wanted to keep the home version of herself intact, the faithful wife, the stressed professional, the woman doing her best. But that version couldn't coexist with the voice I had heard in the kitchen weeks earlier, the voice that said real family like I was a placeholder. She left anyway, heels clicking down the porch steps, and I watched her through the blinds without moving, because movement feels like permission to panic. The moment her car turned the corner, the house felt larger and colder. I walked to the living room where the family tablet sat on the side table, face up like it always was, charging cable coiled beside it. This device wasn't private, and she had never asked me not to touch it because she wanted it to feel neutral. I tapped the screen and saw the lock screen, then the notification banner still there, still showing Victor's name. My jaw tightened, not because I was surprised, but because I hated how casually the truth presented itself. I didn't open the message, and I didn't swipe into threads, and I didn't do anything that could later be framed as digging. I simply photographed the lock screen with my own phone, capturing Victor's name and the partial line, with the date and time visible. Then I stepped back like I had touched a hot surface, because the point wasn't to drown in evidence. The point was to collect enough to keep my footing. By noon, my head had built a small filing cabinet of questions that all opened into the same dark corridor. What exactly did Victor mean by finalize, and why was it on a device that lived in our living room? How long had she been bold enough to let his name appear where I could see it? And why did the message mention Monday, a deadline, as if their betrayal had a schedule like a quarterly review? I didn't have answers yet, but I had something more valuable than answers. I had a documented crack in her wall, and walls usually fail at the cracks first. That evening, I came home at my usual time again, carrying groceries like a man still invested in normal life. Marla was already there, which was new, and she greeted me with too much enthusiasm, which was suspicious. She told me her meeting ended early, and she said it while watching my face for a reaction. I nodded and asked if everything went well, and I asked it with the same mild tone I used when talking about weather. She said it went great. Then she corrected herself and said it was fine. Then she said it had been stressful but productive. 3 versions of the same story in one breath, which told me she was balancing more than a meeting. During dinner, she brought up the topic of timing, casually, like she was complaining about calendar chaos. She said the next few weeks would be busy, and she said there might be late nights, and she said Victor was pushing everyone hard. She didn't say his name like she used to, when it was just her boss's name in a professional sentence. She said it with a small softness now, like saying it gave her comfort. I listened, fork moving slowly, chewing longer than necessary, because the pace of my body needed to stay calm, even if my mind wasn't. I told her I understood, and I told her I could handle a few late nights, and I watched the relief flicker across her face like a match being struck. That relief made me almost laugh, because it meant she believed she was negotiating with a man who still trusted her. After dinner, she showered and left her phone on the counter, face down, as if a face-down phone is the modern version of innocence. I didn't touch it, because touching it would have been satisfying and stupid, and satisfaction is expensive when you're trying to win long-term. Instead, I cleaned the kitchen, wiped the counters, and glanced at the family tablet again, which was now charging in the same place. The lock screen was blank, no new notifications, and the absence felt like a deliberate cleanup. She had seen my eyes flick earlier, and she had adjusted. That meant I had one shot at each mistake she made, and I needed to treat mistakes like rare coins. 2 days later, on Sunday morning, Marla suggested we visit her sister. She said it like it was a spontaneous idea, but her spontaneity had a strange stiffness now, like she was reading from invisible cue cards. I agreed, because refusing would have been a response, and responses were what she expected. In the car, she talked more than usual, filling the air with little facts about nothing: traffic, weather, grocery prices, anything that could prevent silence from turning into suspicion. Her voice was smooth, but her hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, and her nails tapped the leather in a steady rhythm like a countdown. At her sister's house, Marla performed the role of devoted wife with extra polish. She laughed at jokes that weren't funny, complimented the decor more than necessary, and leaned into my shoulder in a way that looked affectionate to observers, but felt staged up close. I played along, smiling at the right moments, asking about work, nodding when appropriate. The sarcasm stayed inside my head where it belonged, a quiet commentary that kept me from drowning. I watched her sister's face, trying to see if she knew anything, but her sister looked ordinary, more tired than conspiratorial. If Marla had told anyone about the plan, she hadn't told her sister, or her sister was a better actor than Marla. When we got home, Marla went straight to the bedroom and said she needed to take a quick call. She said it with the same phrase she always used now, quick call, as if repeating it could make it true. I stayed in the living room and turned on the television at a low volume, pretending to watch a documentary I didn't care about. The family tablet sat on the side table, and I noticed something small that I would have missed weeks ago. The tablet screen lit up for a second, and a banner flashed and disappeared quickly, as if the device was receiving something and then being wiped. I didn't chase it, and I didn't pick it up immediately because I wasn't trying to get caught in a sloppy moment. I waited until the hallway door clicked, until her footsteps moved away, until her voice softened behind the bedroom door. Then I picked up the tablet and tapped the screen once. A notification preview appeared, and it was enough to make my throat go tight. Victor's name again, and a short line mentioning Tuesday and HR. The message was too brief to decode fully, but it carried a shape that felt dangerous. HR was not a word you throw around casually in a personal affair, unless you plan to use it like a shield. It made my earlier thoughts sharpen into a colder suspicion. Marla wasn't just leaving. She was preparing an institutional narrative that would protect her on the way out. I took a photo of the preview with my phone, capturing the date and time again, and I set the tablet back exactly where it had been, cable and all, as if nothing had moved. That night, lying in bed beside her, I stared into the dark and ran the facts through my mind, the way I ran claims through a file at work. Overheard call, pregnant by her boss, leaving me, real family. Notification previews, Victor's name on our household device, deadlines, HR mention, behavior shifts, sudden sweetness, sudden late nights, rehearsed explanations, staged affection. These were not random. These were steps. And if she was making steps, she was going somewhere specific, and she was bringing a story with her. The next morning, I did something I had avoided until then, because it felt like crossing from passive witness into active planner. I created a simple evidence ledger on paper, 1 page, clean columns, no dramatic language. Date, time, device, what appeared, where I was standing, what I did. I wrote the 2 notification events down, listed the photos I took, and I signed the page at the bottom like it was a sworn statement to myself. I didn't feel proud, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, like a man slowly learning he had been living next to a stranger. When Marla came into the kitchen, she looked at me and smiled, and the smile didn't reach her eyes. She asked what I was working on, and she asked it too lightly, as if lightness could keep the ground from cracking. I told her it was nothing important, just notes for a project, and I watched her relax slightly. She poured coffee and talked about her week, mentioning Tuesday again, mentioning a big meeting, mentioning how Victor expected loyalty. I nodded and listened, and inside my head the sarcasm sharpened into something colder. Loyalty, from the woman who had promised another man a real family, was a word that belonged in a museum. That afternoon, while I was at work, I received another lock screen preview on my phone, again from the family tablet, again with Victor's name. This time the line was different, and it hit like a nail driven into clean wood. It said something about making sure I stayed calm, and it mentioned reaction, and it sounded like strategy, not romance. I sat at my desk, eyes on the screen, feeling my pulse rise and then settle, because the message confirmed the part of the story I had been trying not to believe. They weren't just cheating. They were planning how to manage me, how to frame me, how to turn my response into their protection. I took the screenshot, saved it to a folder, and leaned back in my chair, letting the office noise wash over me. Phones rang, printers hummed, keyboards clicked, and the world kept moving like my life hadn't just shifted again. I stared at the evidence ledger photo in my gallery and realized I was no longer collecting proof to understand her. I was collecting proof to survive what she intended to do next. And as I sat there, calm on the outside and razor-edged inside, one question kept repeating in my head with brutal clarity. If they were planning my reaction, what exactly were they about to trigger? By Monday, I stopped thinking of their messages as accidents and started treating them like test balloons. Each lock screen preview was a tiny probe, checking whether I would flinch, whether I would confront, whether I would give them something they could label. The smartest part of their plan was also the laziest part, because they assumed most people cannot sit with uncertainty without trying to fix it. They assumed I would reach for the nearest emotional lever, raise my voice, demand answers, and turn myself into a convenient story. What they did not account for was that my job teaches you to distrust stories that arrive too neatly packaged. When people expect you to react, the best response is to become boring because boredom starves manipulation. Marla left early that morning wearing a fitted coat and a determined expression, like she was going to war, not work. She kissed me on the cheek, told me she had a long day ahead, and reminded me, almost casually, that Victor was under pressure from leadership. The name fell into the air between us like a coin tossed on a table, and I watched it land without moving. When the door shut behind her, I didn't pace or punch the counter or do any of the things men do when they believe anger equals strength. I washed my mug slowly, wiped the countertop, and stared at the wall clock above the sink until I memorized the time. Then I did something simple that required no access, no spying, and no moral gymnastics. I opened the shared calendar we both used for groceries, birthdays, and the harmless logistics of living. The calendar was the kind of small domestic agreement couples make without realizing it can become a battlefield. For years, it had held dentist appointments, oil changes, and the occasional dinner reservation, nothing dramatic enough to matter. Now it felt like a map with missing roads, because Marla had started living a second life inside her first one. I didn't scroll for scandal, and I didn't search for Victor's name like a jealous teenager. I simply looked at the week ahead, then the week behind, comparing patterns the way you compare a statement line that does not match the policy. There it was, a block on Tuesday evening labeled strategy session, vague enough to sound professional, but specific enough to reserve time. The block overlapped with something she had already promised me, a dinner with my parents, which she had pretended to forget until I reminded her. I stared at the overlap and felt my throat tighten, not from heartbreak, but from the audacity of scheduling betrayal like a meeting. I exported the week view as a PDF because PDFs do not argue back later. I made sure the date header was visible, the overlap was visible, and the label was visible. Then I saved it to my personal folder with a file name so plain it could have been homework. I didn't print it because printing makes you feel dramatic, and drama is what they want from you. Instead, I took a photo of the saved file on my phone screen, capturing the time and date. Then I wrote the action in my evidence ledger using the same dry language I used when documenting a claim. I was building a spine, not a spectacle, and spines only need bones. At work, the day moved like it always did, full of people pretending they weren't under pressure. I sat at my desk and watched colleagues rush past, holding coffee like shields, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. My phone buzzed once, then twice, then went quiet again, and each time it buzzed I felt my body try to respond with instinct. I forced myself to breathe slower, because instinct is exactly what Victor and Marla were counting on. Around midday, I received a merchant alert from my bank app, the one tied to my husband-owned card, the one I used for household expenses. The alert showed a charge at a boutique hotel cafe across town, a place Marla and I had never visited together. The amount wasn't huge, which was almost insulting, like they believed a small expense would slip past my attention. I stared at the merchant name and the timestamp, then I did the only thing I needed to do. I took a screenshot of the alert and saved it, because money has a way of telling the truth when people won't. When I got home that evening, Marla was already there, wearing the expression of a woman who had practiced being tired in front of a mirror. She said the day had been brutal, and she said Victor had been relentless, and she said she barely had time to eat. Then she opened the fridge and pulled out leftovers, like a woman who had not just bought a cafe lunch with my card. I nodded and let her talk, because lies expand when you give them room, and she was giving me a full lecture on how hard she was working. I asked one neutral question about her afternoon meeting, and she answered too quickly, naming a conference room that didn't fit the timeline. She corrected herself, then laughed, then blamed stress, and the performance was smooth enough that it would have fooled the man I used to be. The man I was becoming didn't need to call her out. He only needed to note the inconsistency and let it harden into fact. That night, after she fell asleep, I lay awake beside her and listened to the rhythm of her breathing. There was a time when that sound meant safety, the proof that someone I loved was close. Now it sounded like the steady hum of a machine doing its job, indifferent to what it was crushing. I thought about the hotel cafe charge, the calendar overlap, the lock screen previews that mentioned HR and reaction. If Victor was coaching her, he was doing it with the cold confidence of a man who had gotten away with things before. If Marla was following the coaching, she was doing it with the selfish certainty of someone who believed consequences belonged to other people. I turned my head and looked at her face in the dim light, and I felt no urge to wake her, no desire to beg, no craving for closure. I only felt the clean, unpleasant calm of a man watching a bridge crack, already measuring how far the fall would be. On Wednesday, Marla made a subtle shift that told me she was tightening her loop. She started referencing my mood, asking if I was okay, telling me I seemed distant, suggesting I might be stressed. It was careful language, the kind designed to create a record later, a trail of concern that could be twisted into an accusation. She was planting a narrative, and the narrative was that I was unstable, or cold, or emotionally unavailable, because those labels make betrayal look like self-defense. I replied with mild answers and asked her about her day, because nothing ruins a planted story like a husband who refuses to act like the villain. She looked disappointed, and that disappointment almost made me laugh, because I realized she wanted me to be dramatic. She wanted a scene she could point to, a moment she could replay to people who only hear one side. By Friday, she was pushing for a conversation about our future again, but this time she phrased it like a therapy prompt. She asked what I wanted from marriage, whether I felt fulfilled, whether I thought we were growing apart. It was the sort of talk that sounds mature until you realize it is being used as camouflage. I told her I wanted honesty, stability, and respect, and I said it in a tone so calm it made her blink. She tried to steer the conversation toward blame, hinting that I didn't make her feel seen. I nodded and said I was open to counseling if she wanted it, because offering solutions is the fastest way to expose someone who only wants a reason. She didn't like that answer, and she changed the topic to work again, because work was where her real life lived now. That weekend, we attended a small neighborhood gathering, the kind of low-stakes social event where people trade smiles and pretend everything is fine. Marla was unusually affectionate, laughing a little too loudly, touching my arm a little too often, like she was putting on a show for an invisible jury. I played my part, polite and mild, and I watched the way she checked her phone when she thought nobody was looking. At one point, while she was in the kitchen with another woman, the family tablet in our living room pinged again, brightening the screen for a few seconds. I didn't rush to it, because rushing is a confession. I waited until she crossed the room, until her attention was elsewhere. Then I picked up my phone and took a photo of the tablet lock screen from a distance, capturing the preview without touching anything. Victor's name again, and a line about needing her to stick to the plan and keep him calm. The message was clipped, tactical, and ugly, and it confirmed what I had suspected since the first HR mention. This wasn't only an affair, it was a coordinated story build. I saved the photo and slipped my phone back into my pocket. Then I returned to the group like nothing had happened. People talked about sports and renovations and school districts, and I nodded at the right times, listening with half an ear. Inside my head, the evidence ledger was growing heavier, not in volume, but in clarity. Calendar overlap, merchant alert at a hotel cafe, messages about plan and reaction, overheard pregnancy claim and real family speech. Each piece alone could be explained away by a liar with enough charm. Together, they created a pattern so clean it felt deliberate, and that was the point. Victor wasn't hiding from reality, he was betting he could control it. Later that night, after the guests left, Marla confronted me in a small way that was designed to feel accidental. She asked why I had been so quiet at the gathering, and she asked it with the smile of someone offering concern. I told her I had been tired, and I thanked her for hosting, and I said everyone seemed to have a good time. Her smile tightened, and she asked if I was upset about something. I looked at her for a moment longer than normal, letting the silence stretch just enough to make her uncomfortable. Then I said I wasn't upset, and I asked if she was okay, because she seemed stressed lately. The reversal landed softly, and I saw something flicker behind her eyes, not guilt, but irritation. She wanted to interrogate me, not be examined, and the fact that I stayed calm made her feel out of control. I went to my desk after she went to bed and laid out my evidence ledger in front of me. I added the calendar PDF entry, noting the overlap and the label. I added the merchant alert screenshot, noting the time and place. I added the tablet preview photo, noting Victor's language about plan and reaction. I didn't write paragraphs, and I didn't write feelings, because feelings don't hold up when someone tries to rewrite history. I wrote facts, clean and boring, like stones placed in a line. Then I realized something else, something that made my stomach tighten in a different way. If Victor was coaching her to manage my reaction, he was expecting a moment soon where my reaction would matter. That meant they were planning a trigger event, something public enough to need a narrative, something formal enough to involve HR. I stared at the ledger and felt the sarcasm rise like bile, because it was almost impressive how predictable powerful people are when they think they own the rules. I closed the ledger, slid it into a clear sleeve, and labeled the sleeve with the date, because labels are quiet and stubborn. Then I sat back in my chair and listened to the house settle into nighttime silence. Somewhere down the hall, Marla slept like a woman who believed she was the author of the ending. I wasn't going to wake her, and I wasn't going to confront her, because confrontation would only move the story into the arena she wanted. I was going to let her walk forward with her plan, confident and careless, while I collected small truths that could not be argued with. And as I turned off the light, I understood the next step with cold clarity. I didn't need to catch them in a dramatic act, because they were already leaving tracks everywhere they went. I only needed to be patient long enough to let those tracks lead to a door they couldn't lock from the inside. Monday night bled into Tuesday morning the way bad news always does, slow at first, then all at once. I woke up before my alarm, not because I was anxious in the obvious way, but because my body had started treating the house like a place where answers might appear while I slept. Marla was already up, moving quietly through the bedroom, slipping into clothes with the efficiency of someone leaving a scene. She checked her phone before she checked her face in the mirror, which told me exactly what her priorities were now. She looked polished, composed, and slightly impatient, like I was a piece of furniture she had begun to resent for staying in the room. She kissed me goodbye with a quickness that felt procedural, and she left with her suitcase-free confidence, the kind people wear when they believe consequences live somewhere else. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the calendar overlap I had printed to PDF, then saved again, because repetition makes reality feel more solid. I wasn't collecting these things to feel righteous. I was collecting them because they were small anchors in a sea of potential lies. The whole situation had started to feel like one long setup, and setups have one goal: to control how people interpret what happens next. Victor's messages about keeping me calm were not romantic. They were operational. If you ever want to know what someone fears, watch what they prepare for. They were preparing for my reaction, which meant they expected a stage where my reaction could be used against me. At work, the day was already busy enough to disguise anything. People are always in a hurry, always stressed, always one email away from pretending they didn't see the last one. I kept my face neutral and my voice steady, because nothing makes a rumor sharper than a man who looks wounded. I focused on tasks, answered questions, attended meetings, and smiled at the right moments, the way you do when you're trying not to give your enemies free material. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a new alert, and for a second, my body wanted to seize up the way it had that first morning. I forced my hand to move slowly, unlocked the screen, and saw it wasn't the tablet this time. It was an email to my work address, subject line clean and corporate, the kind that looks harmless until you read the first sentence. It was a request from HR to schedule a brief meeting regarding a workplace concern. No details, no context, no names, just a calendar link and a time suggestion for Thursday morning. If it had been anyone else, I might have assumed it was routine, a policy update, a training reminder, some bureaucratic noise. But I had Victor's name sitting in my evidence ledger like a loaded weight, and I had a lock screen preview that mentioned HR and reaction like they were part of the same sentence. I stared at the email and felt something cold slide into place inside me, a quiet certainty that the plan had moved from private to institutional. I didn't forward it to anyone, and I didn't reply with questions that would make me sound panicked. I accepted the tentative time and saved the email as a PDF with the full header visible, because email headers are the closest thing modern life has to fingerprints. Then I wrote it down in the ledger, adding the date and time, the subject line, the fact that it came without details. I didn't know exactly what they were building, but I knew they had started building it in a structure where words become records. HR is a machine that runs on documentation, and people like Victor understand how to feed it. When I came home that evening, Marla was in the kitchen making dinner like she was auditioning for normalcy. She asked about my day with a brightness that was too clean, and I told her it was fine, because fine is a wall. She said she had stayed late, and she blamed Victor's pressure again, and she spoke about him the way some people speak about weather systems, unavoidable and inconvenient. I nodded, and I watched her eyes flick to my briefcase, then back to my face, like she was checking whether I was carrying anything heavy. The sarcasm in my head suggested she was hoping I had brought home flowers to apologize for existing. Instead, I washed my hands and set the table like a man who hadn't noticed the ground shifting under him. After dinner, she tried to steer the conversation into personal territory, the kind that can later be reframed as emotional instability. She asked if I had been feeling down lately, and she said she worried I was bottling things. She asked if I ever felt like my job made me too detached, and she said it like she was offering compassion. It was a neat little trap, because any honest answer could be used against me later. If I admitted stress, she could call it volatility. If I denied it, she could call it denial. I told her I felt normal stress like anyone else, and I said I handled it by being organized and consistent. She smiled, but the smile didn't look pleased. It looked like a woman watching a lock fail to open. That night, she went to bed early and left her phone on the nightstand, face down again, as if the screen itself was guilty. I didn't touch it. I didn't even look at it longer than necessary. Instead, I sat at my desk with my laptop and opened the folder where I had been saving my PDFs and screenshots. I didn't label the folder with anything dramatic, because drama attracts attention. I labeled it Home Admin, because nothing screams harmless like a boring title. I reviewed what I had: the exported calendar week view, the merchant alert from the hotel cafe, the lock screen preview photos, the HR email. It wasn't a smoking gun, and I didn't need it to be. 1,000 small truths beat one large rumor, because small truths are easier to verify and harder to dismiss. On Wednesday morning, I noticed something else, subtle but telling. Marla's behavior shifted from rehearsed affection to controlled distance. She still smiled, still asked the right questions, still played her role, but there was a new impatience underneath it. She started checking the time more often. She started glancing at the door when her phone buzzed. She started speaking about schedules like a woman counting down to a departure. I watched it all with the quiet focus of someone studying a storm that wants to be mistaken for a breeze. At work, people began to act slightly different around me, and that was the first real sting. Not open hostility, not cold shoulders, just a thin layer of caution, like they were handling glass. One coworker who usually joked with me kept the conversation professional and short. Another avoided eye contact, then suddenly remembered a meeting she didn't have. The office didn't feel like it had turned against me, but it felt like it had been warned. Rumors don't need to be spoken to change a room. They only need to be implied. In the afternoon, my manager asked if I could step into his office for a minute. He didn't look angry, and he didn't look concerned in the usual way. He looked careful, like a man trying to navigate a hallway full of hidden wires. He said HR had reached out and mentioned a sensitive matter, and he said it without giving me details, because that's how corporate fear spreads, in vague phrases that sound responsible. I told him I had already scheduled the HR meeting, and I said I would cooperate fully, because cooperation is the only language that leaves you standing when people want you to fall. He nodded, relieved I wasn't making a scene, and told me to keep him updated. When I left his office, I felt the weight of something new. This wasn't just Marla leaving. This was Marla and Victor laying tracks in my workplace, where consequences could be immediate and public. That evening at home, Marla asked if anything was new at work. She said it casually, but her eyes watched me too closely, and the question was too perfectly timed to be innocent. I told her things were normal, just the usual midweek chaos, and I watched her shoulders relax like she had been holding her breath. She wasn't asking because she cared about my day. She was asking because she cared about her timeline. She wanted to know whether the machine had started to move. After she went to shower, I sat on the couch and stared at the family tablet across the room like it was a witness that didn't know it was talking. The screen lit up briefly with a new notification, then went dark. I didn't rush to it, but I did note the exact time on the wall clock because timing is how you pin people down without touching them. When she returned, hair damp, phone in hand, she moved to the tablet and tapped it once, too casually, too quickly, like she was clearing a surface. The gesture lasted 2 seconds, but it felt like a confession. She was managing notifications now, cleaning her own fingerprints as she walked. Later, when she fell asleep, I wrote down what I had seen. I kept it plain. Time of notification, her immediate interaction, her quick dismissal. I wasn't claiming I knew what she erased, because claims without proof are how people lose credibility. I was simply documenting behavior that supported a larger pattern. And as I wrote, I realized something that made the whole situation feel even uglier. If Victor was comfortable enough to coordinate HR pressure, then Marla's pregnancy claim might not be the only lie in play. People who build narratives that aggressively rarely stop at one. They build layers, and the layers are designed to crush anyone who tries to peel them back. Thursday morning arrived with the heavy quiet of a day you know will leave marks. I dressed carefully, not to impress anyone, but to remove any excuse for judgment. I chose neutral colors, clean shoes, no sloppy edges, because people love to mistake appearance for stability. At work, the HR meeting sat on my calendar like a loaded appointment. Colleagues moved around me with polite distance, and I could feel the rumor's outline even if I couldn't hear its words. That is how these things spread, not as a statement, but as a shape. 10 minutes before the HR meeting, my phone buzzed again, and my stomach tightened with the instinct that something had just moved. It was another notification preview from the family tablet, and Victor's name was there like a signature. The text was short, clipped, almost impatient, and it mentioned that today would decide whether I stayed quiet or made it worse. I took the screenshot without hesitation, saved it, and felt a calm settle over me that was almost frightening. They were confirming their intent in real time, using a household device like it was a safe channel. They weren't just cheating and planning. They were actively steering an institutional event while I was walking toward it. I stood up from my desk, straightened my jacket, and walked toward HR with steady steps, because steady steps are a refusal to be framed. The hallway lights were harsh, and the carpet muffled sound, and every part of the office felt too clean for what was about to happen. When I reached the HR door, I saw the nameplate on the wall, and I saw the conference room through the glass, and I realized I wasn't walking into a meeting. I was walking into the first public version of their story. And as I placed my hand on the door handle, one sharp thought cut through everything else, clean as a blade. If they were this confident today, what exactly had Marla already told them about me? The HR conference room smelled like printer toner and lemon cleaner, the kind of sterile combination that pretends it is neutral while it quietly picks a side. I walked in with my shoulders level, my hands empty, and my face set to the same calm I use when someone hands me a problem they already tried to solve with panic. 2 people sat at the table, the HR director and an employee relations specialist, both wearing polite expressions that never quite reached the eyes. A third chair was empty, positioned at a slight angle like it had been reserved for a witness who might arrive later. On the wall behind them, a framed poster promised respect and integrity in glossy corporate fonts, which would have been funny if it weren't about to be weaponized. They gestured for me to sit, and I sat without rushing, because speed looks like guilt to people who live on assumptions. The HR director began with a measured tone and the kind of careful language that keeps liability at arm's length. They said there had been a concern raised about my conduct, and they said they needed to ask a few questions, and they said this was standard procedure. They did not name the concern at first, which is how these meetings usually start, when the goal is to watch your expression before they offer details. I kept my expression flat and asked what the specific allegation was, because vague concerns are like smoke, and smoke is easy to shape into monsters. The specialist glanced at the director, then read from notes, describing an incident involving domestic instability that might spill into the workplace. The phrase was so unnatural it felt rehearsed, like someone had built it from a template and handed it over with a bow. They said there was worry I might react unpredictably due to personal stressors, and they said the concern came from someone who believed I had been struggling emotionally. The director added that they had received a note suggesting I might be experiencing fixation and heightened agitation, which are the kinds of words people use when they want the record to sound clinical without needing a clinician. I listened, nodded once, and asked who made the report, because anonymous concern is the laziest kind of accusation. They said they could not disclose the source at this stage, and they said it was meant to protect confidentiality, and they said the company had a duty of care. It was the first time I felt anger rise in my chest, not hot and reckless, but cold and precise, because duty of care is a phrase that can cover a lot of quiet cruelty. I asked what specific conduct had been alleged, what date it supposedly happened, and what workplace policy it was tied to, because without those three things you are not investigating, you are fishing. The specialist said there were no claims of violence, no threats, and no direct workplace incidents, which would have been reassuring if it weren't also suspicious. The director said the concern was preventive, based on the possibility that I might confront someone at work due to a personal issue. When I heard that, the outline of their plan sharpened in my mind like a photograph coming into focus. This wasn't about something I had done. This was about what they wanted to claim I might do, which meant the story was designed to box me in before I ever moved. I told them I would answer questions, but I wanted the allegations stated clearly in writing, because clarity is the enemy of narrative games. The director said they were documenting the conversation, and they could provide a summary later. I nodded again, then said I was not aware of any workplace issue involving my conduct, and I asked whether this personal issue involved my wife or my home. The director hesitated for half a second too long, then said they couldn't discuss third parties, but the concern was that I might have learned of something upsetting and might not handle it appropriately. The word learned did not belong in a generic wellness concern, and it sat in the air like a fingerprint. I let the silence stretch for a moment, then asked whether my supervisor had been informed and whether any disciplinary process had been initiated. They said no disciplinary process was initiated, and that this was a check-in, but the specialist's tone carried the faint edge of warning. I kept my voice steady and said I had no intention of confronting anyone at work, and I had not made any threats, and I had not acted inappropriately. Then I asked the simplest question, the question that forces liars to pick a lane. I asked whether they were suggesting I was a risk to workplace safety, or whether they were suggesting I had harassed someone. The director said neither, and they said the company just wanted to ensure I had support. Support was the pretty wrapper on a knife, and they were offering it with two hands like it was a gift. I told them I appreciated the concern, but I wanted the report's claims narrowed to verifiable statements, because I would not accept vague labels attached to my name. The specialist tried to steer back to feelings, asking how I was coping, asking if I had been sleeping, asking if I felt triggered, and the questions were designed to make me describe myself in ways that could be quoted later. I answered politely, briefly, and consistently, because consistency is a shield. I said I was functioning normally, meeting deadlines, and maintaining professional conduct. I said my sleep was fine, my performance was stable, and I had no conflicts with coworkers. The director asked if anything in my personal life might cause me to act out, and I almost laughed, because act out is what people accuse children of doing, not grown men with paychecks and reputations. I told them I had personal matters like anyone else, but nothing that affected my workplace behavior. Then I asked, again, whether the company had any evidence, any emails, any statements, any incident reports, anything at all, beyond a concerned narrative. The director said there was no evidence of workplace misconduct, and at that point, the entire meeting revealed its true purpose. It wasn't an investigation, it was a preemptive frame, built to exist on paper before the real mess hit the floor. When the meeting ended, the director told me to reach out if I needed resources, and they suggested I avoid engagement with anyone who might provoke me. That last phrase landed with a dull thud, because it was almost an instruction to remain silent while someone else built the story. I stood up, thanked them, and asked for the case reference number or the internal tracking number for the meeting notes, because even their paperwork should have to wear a name tag. The specialist provided a simple reference code, and I repeated it back to confirm it, because memory is unreliable and repetition is not. I left the room without slamming the door, without making a face, without giving anyone a dramatic exit to remember. In the hallway, the carpet still muted my steps, and the fluorescent lights still made everyone look pale, and I realized I was walking through a building that had already been told to be afraid of me. Back at my desk, I opened a blank document and wrote down the time, the participants, the claims made, and the exact phrases that mattered. I did not write my emotions, because emotions are subjective, and I did not write accusations, because accusations without proof are how people lose leverage. I wrote facts. They claimed preventive concern, they claimed personal stressor, they claimed fear of confrontation, they admitted no evidence of workplace misconduct, they recorded a reference code. Then I saved the document as a PDF and filed it with the rest of the evidence, because the only way to survive a narrative war is to build a record that stays boring when the other side becomes theatrical. When I returned home that evening, the house was quiet in the way it gets quiet when someone is waiting for news. Marla was on the couch, legs tucked under her, phone in hand, television on, but ignored. She looked up too quickly when I entered, like she had been listening for my key, and she put on a concerned expression that arrived a second late. She asked how my day was, and she asked it with a softness that sounded practiced. I told her it was fine, because fine is what you say when you refuse to become someone else's evidence. She watched me carefully, scanning for cracks, searching for the anger she had prepared to describe to other people. When she didn't find it, she adjusted, leaning into affection again, asking if I wanted dinner, asking if I was okay, asking if I seemed tired. Her concern was a performance, but the performance had tension in it now, like the actor had forgotten the next line. I went to the kitchen, poured water, and checked the wall clock out of habit, because time had become the only honest thing in the room. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was the shared tablet preview, Victor's name flashing on my screen like a dare. The message was short enough to fit in one ugly breath, and it said they needed to know how it went, and it said I had to stay calm, and it said if I reacted wrong it would help them. I took the screenshot immediately, saved it, and felt a dark satisfaction settle in my chest. They were feeding instructions through a household device while the institution did their dirty work, which meant their arrogance had crossed into carelessness. They had built a plan around me being loud, and they could not comprehend a man who becomes quieter as the stakes rise. Marla came into the kitchen, saw my face, and hesitated, because she could sense something shift, even if she couldn't see what it was. She asked what was on my phone, and she tried to sound casual, but the words came out slightly clipped. I told her it was nothing, just a work notification, and I let my tone stay flat and bored, because boredom is the poison that kills manipulation slowly. She nodded, but her eyes stayed on my hands for a beat too long, like she wanted to see whether I was shaking. My hands didn't shake, and that seemed to upset her more than anger would have. She poured herself a glass of water, then set it down without drinking, then picked it up again, and I watched the small loop of nervous behavior like it was a confession in motion. Later, in bed, she tried to pull me into a conversation about communication, and she tried to turn the night into a relationship workshop. She asked whether I ever felt like I couldn't trust people, and she asked whether I had been feeling suspicious lately, and each question was a hook with a legal-friendly word attached. I answered with simple, calm statements, and I refused to describe myself as unstable, or paranoid, or threatened. I told her I believed trust is earned through consistent actions, and I said I valued calm conversation over emotional theater. She went quiet after that, not because she was moved, but because she couldn't find a sentence she could later repeat to someone else with advantage. When she finally fell asleep, her breathing deep and even, I sat up in the dark and looked at the ceiling again, feeling the weight of the day settle into my bones. HR had tried to pre-frame me, and Marla had waited at home like a reporter expecting a headline. Victor had sent live instructions like a director guiding an actor through a scene. It was all connected, all coordinated, all designed to make me the unstable element while they moved cleanly toward their real family. And in that quiet darkness, I understood a truth that was both ugly and oddly liberating. They weren't afraid of my anger. They were afraid of my composure, because composure is the one thing that keeps their story from sticking. I reached for my phone, opened the saved screenshot of Victor's message, and stared at it until the words stopped feeling surreal. Then I added it to the evidence ledger with the exact time, the device source, and the fact that it arrived on a day HR tried to box me in. I placed the ledger back into its sleeve, set it in the drawer, and closed the drawer gently, because gentle is what you do when you are building something that must survive scrutiny. Marla slept beside me like a woman convinced she still controlled the narrative, and Victor slept somewhere else like a man confident his power could erase consequences. I lay back down and let my eyes close, not because I was at peace, but because I had reached a new stage of clarity. They had fired their first institutional shot, and they had missed the target they thought they were aiming at. The next morning would bring new lies, new tests, and new attempts to force me into the role they wrote for me. But now I had something they did not expect me to have. Proof that their plan existed in real time, and proof that they were coordinating it while pretending it was concern. And as my breathing slowed in the dark, one thought kept repeating with calm, sarcastic certainty. If they wanted a story where I looked dangerous, then I would give them a story where the only dangerous thing was the truth. By Friday, the house had stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a waiting room. Marla moved through it like a visitor who knew she would not be staying, touching surfaces lightly, leaving no mess, leaving no warmth. She was careful with her words now, careful with her tone, careful with the kind of kindness that is really just a clean pair of gloves. Every time she asked if I was okay, it sounded less like love and more like quality control. I kept giving her the same calm answers because nothing irritates a manipulator more than a target who refuses to tremble. If Victor wanted to provoke me into a workplace spectacle, then my job was to become the most boring man alive. At work, the aftertaste of the HR meeting lingered in the air like cheap cologne. People were polite, but the politeness had edges, the way it does when someone has been warned to be careful. One coworker asked if everything was all right at home, and she asked it with the kind of softness that pretends to be support while it collects data. I smiled and said everything was fine, because fine is a locked door that does not creak. My supervisor avoided personal conversation entirely, which told me he had been coached to treat me like a potential hazard. The company hadn't punished me, but it had moved me into a quieter box, the place where you put people while you decide whether they are safe to keep. Victor did not need to fire me to hurt me. He only needed to make me look like a problem. That afternoon, I received a new calendar invite, and it was almost too perfect. It was for a performance alignment check-in scheduled for the following week, a meeting I hadn't had in years. The invite came from my manager, but the language looked like it had been written by HR, all careful phrases and soft warnings. I didn't decline it, and I didn't reply with questions, because questions would sound defensive. I accepted it and saved the invite details as a PDF with the header visible, because the best way to survive a paper war is to keep your own paper clean. Then I added it to my evidence folder and wrote the entry in my ledger like I was documenting weather. At home that evening, Marla acted lighter than she had all week, and the lightness made my skin crawl. She suggested we go out for dinner, and she suggested it with the energy of someone trying to create a public alibi. She wanted a picture of us smiling, a small piece of proof that the marriage was fine. I agreed, because refusing would have created tension she could later describe as instability. We went to a busy place where the staff recognized us, and Marla made sure they saw her holding my arm, laughing, leaning in. She performed affection like a brand, and I played along like a man who didn't understand he was being used. Halfway through dinner, her phone buzzed, and she glanced down too quickly. She didn't smile, and she didn't look annoyed, which told me it wasn't a friend. She typed a short response, then put the phone face down again, and her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her glass. She tried to hide the tremor by sipping, but the sip was too fast, too thirsty, like she needed something to steady herself. I watched without commenting, because commenting is an invitation. The only thing I did was note the time on my own phone under the table, because time is the rope you use to tie lies down later. On the drive home, Marla talked about Victor more than usual, but she talked about him like a problem she had to manage. She mentioned how he expected loyalty, how he hated surprises, how he wanted people who didn't cause complications. I listened and nodded, and my sarcasm quietly did its work. She was describing him like a boss, but she was also describing him like a man she feared. That mattered, because fear changes how people make mistakes, and mistakes were what I needed. The next morning, Saturday, Marla announced she needed to run errands, and she said it like it was routine. She listed the errands too carefully: grocery store, pharmacy, quick stop at the bank, then back home. The list sounded rehearsed, which meant it was probably incomplete. She asked if I wanted to come with her, and she asked it with a brightness that sounded forced. She wanted me to decline so she could report that I was distant, but she also wanted the option of saying she invited me. I told her I would stay home and do laundry, because laundry is the kind of boring truth nobody can argue with. She kissed me quickly and left, and I watched her car disappear like a man watching the last train leave a station. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a merchant alert again, and I felt the cold calm settle in immediately. The alert showed a charge at a maternity boutique across town, a place that did not sell anything you buy casually. The amount was small, but the merchant name was loud. I stared at the screen, then took a screenshot, because money never lies on principle, it lies only when people move it, and she wasn't clever enough to move it quietly. I saved the screenshot, labeled it with the date, then wrote the entry in my ledger with the kind of dry clarity that makes excuses look childish. When Marla returned, she carried one small bag that looked too light for her claimed errands. She moved quickly, set the bag on the counter, then slid it toward a cabinet like she hoped it would vanish. Her eyes flicked to me, checking whether I had noticed. I asked how the errands went, and she said fine, then she said busy, then she said traffic was terrible. 3 answers again, stacked like cheap plates. I nodded and told her I was glad she made it back safely, and I watched her relax slightly. She didn't know I already had the merchant alert, which meant I now had something sharper than suspicion. I had an external record that matched the overheard call I had never confronted her about. That night, she tried to start a conversation about the future again, but this time it was wrapped in practicality. She mentioned that housing prices were rising, that maybe we should consider downsizing, that maybe we should simplify. Simplify was her favorite word lately, because it made betrayal sound like budgeting. She asked what I thought about living closer to her job, and she said it like she was making a smart choice for both of us. I told her we could discuss it when she had a clear plan and a clear reason, because I did not make decisions on vague moods. Her jaw tightened for a second, then she smiled again, the smile of a woman reminding herself to stay calm. I wondered if Victor had taught her that smile, the same way he had taught her those HR-friendly phrases. Sunday brought a new pressure, and it came from a place Marla did not control. My mother called and asked if we were still coming to dinner on Tuesday, the dinner Marla had pretended to forget. I looked at Marla as my mother spoke, and I watched the tension rise in her shoulders like a string being pulled. She mouthed that she was busy, then mouthed that she had work, then mouthed a vague apology. I told my mother we would be there because commitments matter and because Marla needed to feel the walls closing in. After I ended the call, Marla asked why I had said yes without checking with her, and her tone sharpened just enough to show the real blade. I told her it was a family dinner, not a hostage negotiation, and I said it with calm sarcasm that made her blink. She turned away quickly, and I could tell she was texting someone, likely Victor, likely asking how to handle it. That evening, the family tablet lit up again while we were in the living room, and this time Marla couldn't get to it fast enough. The lock screen preview appeared for 2 seconds, and I saw Victor's name and the words, "Keep him away," before it disappeared. Marla grabbed the tablet, tapped it, then set it down again like nothing happened. She looked at me too quickly afterward, eyes wide for a heartbeat, then narrowed with forced calm. She asked if I wanted to watch a movie, and the question sounded like a bribe. I nodded and said sure, because sure is another door that doesn't open. Inside my pocket, my phone recorded the exact time, because time is how you make people trip over their own plans. Later that night, when she fell asleep, I sat at my desk and laid out the new pieces of the ledger. I added the maternity boutique merchant alert screenshot, noting the time and place. I added the reminder about Tuesday dinner, noting her resistance and her instant retreat into texting. I added my observation of the tablet preview, but I wrote it carefully as what I saw, not what I assumed. I didn't write that Victor told her to keep me away, because that is interpretation. I wrote that I saw the phrase "keep him away" on a preview banner attached to Victor's name, visible for 2 seconds. Facts, not drama, because facts survive cross-examination. I stared at the ledger and felt something shift again, not toward rage, but toward strategy. They were pushing to isolate me from public family moments, and they were building a workplace frame that treated me like a risk. Those 2 moves did not happen by accident. They wanted my parents to see me alone and tense, and they wanted my job to see me as unstable. That way, when Marla finally stepped out with her real family story, she could claim she was escaping a man who was unraveling. It was clean, cruel, and almost clever, which meant Victor's fingerprints were all over it. On Monday morning, Marla announced she had an early off-site on Tuesday evening, the same evening as my parents' dinner. She delivered the statement with fake regret and a careful sigh, as if the schedule controlled her, not her choices. I told her I understood, and I told her I would still go, because my parents deserved my presence, even if she didn't. Her eyes narrowed slightly, then softened, as if she realized she needed a different angle. She said she might be able to stop by late, and she said it like she was doing us a favor. I nodded and said that would be nice, and I watched her face carefully. She wasn't thinking about being late. She was thinking about whether she could turn late into an excuse, a story, a weapon. That afternoon, I received a text from Marla while I was still at work, and it was short enough to feel like a trap. She said she had been feeling sick lately, and she said she might need to see a doctor soon. She did not say why she was sick, and she did not say what kind of doctor, and she did not mention pregnancy. She was laying the first brick of a new narrative, one where she could later claim she was vulnerable and unsupported. I replied with a simple statement that I was sorry she felt unwell, and I asked what appointment time she wanted, because practical concern is hard to twist. She didn't respond for an hour, and when she finally did, she said she would handle it herself. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling again, listening to her breathing and thinking about the shape of the week ahead. Tuesday dinner with my parents was now a battleground, and Thursday workplace alignment meeting was another. Victor was tightening the screws on both ends, and Marla was moving like a woman trying to slip through a closing door. The evidence I had was still household level, still lawful, still boring, and that was exactly why it was strong. It didn't rely on spying or secret access, only on what they kept carelessly leaving in the open. I turned my head and looked at Marla, and for the first time in weeks I felt a clean certainty about the next step. They expected me to confront in private, to plead, to accuse, to break. I wasn't going to give them that. I was going to let Tuesday happen, let the family room fill with witnesses, let her excuses collide with the clock, and let her own words and records do the cutting. If she wanted to build a story, then she could build it in front of people who would remember the details. And as I finally closed my eyes, one thought sat in my mind like a loaded question waiting for its moment. If Victor was telling her to keep me away, what exactly was she afraid I would see when she walked through my parents' front door, late? Tuesday arrived with the kind of brightness that makes bad decisions look innocent. The sky was clean, the air was cold, and the whole day felt too ordinary for the amount of damage sitting behind my ribs. Marla moved around the house in the morning like she was preparing for a performance, not a family dinner. She dressed with extra care, checked her phone more than once, and kept a small smile on her face that never matched her eyes. When she said she might be late, she said it the way people announce a weather forecast, like it was out of her hands and nobody should take it personally. I told her it was fine, because fine is what you say when you are done negotiating with a liar. At work, I kept my head down and my tone even, and I let the day pass without giving anyone a story. The performance alignment meeting loomed on my calendar like a polite threat, but I treated it like any other appointment, because treating danger like routine is how you deny it oxygen. By late afternoon, I had already decided the shape of the evening, and it was simple. I would show up on time, I would be present, I would be calm, and I would let her absence speak for itself. If she wanted to build a narrative where I was unstable, then I would build a counter-narrative where the only unstable thing was her timeline. I arrived at my parents' house with a bottle of wine and the neutral face of a man who had nothing to confess. My mother opened the door with that immediate warmth that used to feel like safety, and now felt like a test I couldn't afford to fail. My father was in the living room, already watching the clock like he didn't want to admit he was watching it. My sister was there too, perched on the edge of the couch, smiling in a way that suggested she had sensed tension, but hadn't found the source yet. The house smelled like roasted food and family habits, and the comfort of it almost made me angry, because comfort should not have to share a room with betrayal. They asked where Marla was, not accusingly at first, just with normal curiosity. I told them she had a last-minute off-site and might arrive late, and I made sure my voice stayed flat. My mother frowned, because she has always hated excuses that come wrapped in corporate language. My father made a small noise and said work always finds a way to steal time, which is what people say when they want to avoid naming something sharper. My sister looked at me a little longer than necessary, like she was checking whether I looked different, but I gave her nothing. I didn't come to recruit them into my pain. I came to let reality land on its own, because reality lands harder when you don't throw it. Dinner began without Marla, and that alone created a faint ripple in the room. My mother tried to keep the energy warm, but her eyes kept flicking toward the hallway like she expected the front door to open. My father stayed quiet, polite and attentive, but he asked about Marla twice more, which meant he was bothered. I answered the same way each time, with the same calm, because consistency matters in rooms where people remember patterns. My sister tried to lighten things, asking about work, asking about small plans, but the conversation kept circling back to the empty chair like a tongue exploring a sore tooth. Halfway through the meal, my phone buzzed in my pocket, and my body tightened with the instinct to check it. I resisted the urge to move quickly, because quick movements look like panic, and panic is what people remember. I excused myself politely and stepped into the kitchen, where the hum of the refrigerator covered the sound of my breathing. The notification was a merchant alert again, and it made my stomach go cold. It wasn't the maternity boutique this time. It was a charge at a hotel restaurant downtown, the kind of place Marla never visited for errands. The timestamp was recent, within the last hour, which meant she was not at an off-site in some anonymous conference room. She was in a place where dinners are planned, reservations are made, and people don't go alone when they are building a real family. I took the screenshot and saved it immediately, then noted the time, because time turns vague suspicion into a nailed-down fact. I stared at the screen for a second longer than I should have, letting the truth settle without letting it show on my face. Then I returned to the dining room with my posture steady and my expression neutral, because my parents deserved a son who could sit at their table without turning it into a crime scene. My mother asked if everything was all right, and I told her it was fine, because fine is what you say when the truth is still loading. The doorbell rang around 8:30, and the whole room shifted at once. My mother stood quickly, smoothing her hands on her apron like she was preparing to greet a guest she had been forced to wait for. My father's jaw tightened slightly, and my sister leaned forward, curiosity and caution mixing in her eyes. My mother opened the door, and Marla stepped in with a controlled smile and a coat that looked too warm for the short distance she claimed she had traveled. Her hair was too neat for a rushed day, and her lipstick looked freshly checked. She carried a small bag, not a work bag, but something compact, like she had been traveling light. Her eyes found mine immediately, and I watched her read my face the way a gambler reads a table. Marla greeted my mother with a practiced warmth and apologized for being late, blaming the off-site and traffic and a last-minute situation. She spread the excuses out like a blanket, hoping it would cover whatever smell she brought in with her. My mother accepted the apology, but she didn't look convinced. My father nodded politely, but he did not smile. My sister gave Marla a quick hug and then stepped back, and I saw her eyes flick to Marla's bag like she sensed something off. Marla moved into the dining room and took her seat, and the empty chair stopped being a symbol and became a person again, which somehow felt worse. For the first few minutes, Marla played her role perfectly. She complimented the food, asked my father about his week, asked my mother about a neighbor's health, and laughed at the right moments. She looked like a woman trying to repair a social thread she had already cut. My mother tried to be gracious, but she asked Marla what the off-site had been about, and the question landed like a weight. Marla hesitated, then said it was a planning session, then added it was confidential, then added it had been intense. 3 answers again, stacked like she couldn't find one that fit. My father's eyes narrowed slightly, and my sister glanced at me, just once, like she was checking whether I had noticed the wobble. I kept eating, kept breathing, kept my face calm, because calm is a weapon when everyone else is waiting for you to explode. Then Marla made a mistake, the kind of mistake people make when they are trying too hard to sound normal. She mentioned she had grabbed a quick bite downtown between meetings, and she said it casually, like it was nothing. My mother nodded, but my father asked which place, and the question came out too sharp to be accidental. Marla named a cafe that didn't match the hotel restaurant charge on my phone, and the lie landed in the room with a soft thud nobody could quite ignore. My sister's eyebrows lifted slightly, and my mother's mouth tightened, and even Marla seemed to realize she had just placed a foot on a loose board. She tried to smooth it over by talking faster, but talking faster only makes people listen harder. My mother stood to bring dessert, and as she moved behind Marla's chair, Marla's compact bag shifted on the floor. A small card slid out from the bag, landing face up near the chair leg. My mother paused, bent down to pick it up, and her eyes narrowed as she read it. She didn't announce what it was, and she didn't wave it like a flag, but the tension in her shoulders changed. She walked to the kitchen with the card in her hand, and I watched Marla notice too late, her eyes following my mother like a dog watching its leash being carried away. My father asked Marla again about her day, and Marla's answer started to fray. She said the offsite had started early, then said it had shifted, then said she had been called downtown suddenly. The details didn't line up, and the room felt smaller with each sentence. My sister's gaze stayed fixed on Marla now, no longer friendly, no longer polite, just attentive in a way that made Marla's smile stiffen. I could feel Marla trying to steer the conversation away from specifics and into feelings, but my father wasn't letting her. He asked simple questions that required simple answers, and Marla kept giving answers that changed shape. My mother returned with dessert and set it down, but she didn't sit immediately. She stood behind her chair, holding the small card, and her voice had changed, becoming quieter and more controlled. She asked Marla what the card was, and she asked it without drama, the way you ask when you already know the answer is going to hurt. Marla's face went pale for half a second. Then she forced a laugh that sounded wrong in the room. She said it was nothing, just a reminder, just a receipt, just something from the day. My mother held it out, and I could see it clearly now, a parking validation slip from the downtown hotel, stamped with a time that matched my merchant alert. Marla tried to take it quickly, but my mother kept her hand steady, not aggressive, just firm. My father leaned forward, eyes locked on the slip, and my sister's mouth parted slightly as she read the printed details. Marla's smile collapsed into something tighter, and she started to explain again, but her words came out too fast and too layered. She claimed she had parked there because it was close, then claimed she had met a coworker, then claimed she had been waiting for a taxi. The lies stacked so quickly, they started to crush each other. I finally spoke, not loudly, not emotionally, just with the calm tone of a man placing a simple fact on the table. I said the hotel restaurant charge hit our shared account an hour ago, and I said the time on the slip matched it, and I said I didn't understand why her off-site required dinner downtown. The room went silent, in the way rooms go silent when the truth arrives, and everyone realizes they are now part of it. Marla stared at me like I had broken a rule she thought existed, the rule where I was supposed to keep my suspicions private so she could control the public version. My mother's eyes moved between us, and my father's face hardened into a look I hadn't seen since I was a teenager, caught in an obvious lie. My sister sat very still, like she didn't want to move and accidentally knock the truth off the table. Marla opened her mouth to speak again, but no clean story came out. Only fragments, only excuses, only the faint sound of a narrative collapsing under its own weight. And in that stretched silence, I realized something sharper than the parking slip, something that made my skin go cold. Marla's bag was still on the floor, slightly open, and inside it I could see the corner of a folded paper, thick and glossy, the kind of paper clinics use for printed images. My mother saw it too, because her eyes dropped and her hand tightened around the parking slip. My father saw it next, because his gaze followed hers, and his shoulders lifted slightly as if bracing. Marla noticed their attention and shifted her foot to block the bag, but it was too late, because the room had already locked onto it like a target. And as my mother asked, in that same quiet voice, what else Marla brought home from downtown tonight, Marla's face finally cracked just enough to reveal how afraid she really was. Marla's foot moved again, trying to hide the bag like a child trying to cover a spilled drink with a napkin. It was a small motion, but in a room full of people who had just watched her lie in layers, small motions suddenly had weight. My mother did not raise her voice, and she did not accuse, which made her question worse. She asked what else Marla had brought home from downtown tonight, and she asked it as if she were asking about a forgotten dessert tray. Marla's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, and I watched her decide which version of herself to present. She chose the version that pretended nothing was happening, the version that relied on smiles and speed. She said the bag was just paperwork, just notes from her day, just personal items, and she reached down to zip it. My father's hand came up, palm out, not threatening, just stopping the motion the way you stop someone from grabbing a knife. Marla froze, and my sister made a small sound like she was inhaling too sharply. My mother stepped closer, her face pale but controlled, and she asked Marla to stop moving and answer the question. That was the moment the dinner stopped being a family routine and became something else. A courtroom without a judge, a room where the walls remember what happens. Marla looked at me then, and for the first time that night her eyes asked for help, not love, not forgiveness, just a way out. It would have been easy to rescue her with a soft sentence, to turn the room back into normal, to let her leave with her lies intact. That is what people do when they are still attached to hope, and I had already buried hope weeks ago in the quiet space behind my ribs. I told her she could explain, and I kept my tone flat because flatness removes the comfort of drama. I said the truth was better than whatever she was building, and I said it like I was talking about a broken appliance. Marla swallowed and finally admitted the paper in the bag was from a clinic. She did not say pregnancy yet, and she did not say boss yet, because naming the real thing makes it real in front of witnesses. She said she had been feeling unwell. She said she went to check. She said she didn't know what it meant. 3 answers again, the same pattern, the same panic. My mother's eyes narrowed and her voice remained steady as she asked which clinic and why it was near the hotel. Marla said it was near her off-site, then said it was convenient, then said she had been scared. Convenient and scared do not live well together in the same sentence. My father asked the simplest question in the world, and he asked it like a man who has lived long enough to recognize the moment a family fractures. He asked if she was pregnant. Marla's shoulders lifted slightly, her breath caught, and then she nodded once. My sister's face went blank in the way it goes blank when you are trying not to cry in front of people. My mother sat down slowly as if her legs had stopped trusting her. I felt something cold pass through me, not shock, because I already knew, but confirmation, the kind that turns a private nightmare into a public fact. Marla kept talking, trying to soften the impact, saying she had not planned it, saying she had been confused, saying she had been trying to figure out how to tell me. Her words sounded like foam, light and useless, because foam cannot hold weight. Then my mother asked whose baby it was. The question was quiet, but it ripped through the room. Marla hesitated too long, and the hesitation said everything before her mouth did. She whispered that it was complicated, then whispered that it was not mine, then whispered that she was sorry. My sister pressed her lips together and stared at the table, and my father's face tightened into a kind of anger I rarely saw. My mother looked at me, not as if asking what I had done, but as if realizing I had been carrying this alone for too long. I kept my posture steady, because if I moved too quickly, the room would remember that movement instead of her words. Marla tried to reach for my hand, and I moved my hand away calmly, not dramatically, just removing contact. She started crying then, but the crying felt late, like it had been scheduled as a strategy, and now she was using it because she had no better tool. My mother asked again, this time naming the missing piece without naming it directly. She asked if there was another man. Marla nodded, and my father asked who. Marla looked down and whispered his name, and even though I had already known it, hearing it in my parents' dining room felt like hearing profanity in a church. Victor. A simple name, a simple sound, and it made the whole room feel dirty. My sister's eyes widened because she knew who Victor was, because she had met him at the company picnic once, because she had watched him shake my hand with a smile that looked like a deal. My father asked if Victor was her boss, and Marla nodded again, and my mother's mouth tightened as if she were trying not to say something that would scorch the room. My father leaned back in his chair, stared at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at me with a heavy, quiet question in his eyes. Why had I let it reach this table? I answered his look without changing my voice. I said I found out weeks ago, and I said I did not want to drag them into it without proof and without a plan. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed controlled as she asked what Marla had planned to do. Marla tried to speak, but my father cut through her with a single blunt question. He asked if she planned to leave me. Marla hesitated, and that hesitation was the second major betrayal, the one that hurts even when you expect it. She nodded again, and she said she thought it was better, and she said she thought it was time, and she said she wanted a real family. The phrase real family landed like a slap, because it didn't just insult me, it insulted everyone at the table who had treated her like one of us. My mother made a small sound, half pain, half disgust, and my father's eyes hardened. My sister finally spoke, and her voice trembled as she asked Marla how she could say that in this house, at this table, after years of being welcomed. Marla tried to justify it, saying she had felt lonely, saying she had felt unseen, saying Victor made her feel valued. It was the classic script, the one people use when they want their betrayal to sound like self-care. I listened without interrupting, because people reveal more when they think you are absorbing their speech. She kept talking, adding details she didn't realize were evidence, describing how Victor promised stability, how he said he could take care of her, how he said he could make her life simpler. That last word again, simpler. And I felt the sarcasm rise like a dark laugh I refused to let out. Victor had promised simplicity to a woman who couldn't keep one story straight for an hour. My father asked if Victor knew she was pregnant, and Marla said yes. My mother asked if Victor was married, and Marla said no, but her answer came too fast. My sister asked if she had told anyone else, and Marla admitted she had told a friend, and then admitted she had told someone at work. The admissions kept spilling now because she thought confession would soften consequence. Then my father asked whether Victor had been involved in what happened at my work, and the room froze again. Marla blinked, confused for a second, and then her face changed as if she had realized she had walked into a trap she didn't know existed. My mother looked at me sharply, and I told them about the HR meeting, told them someone had filed a concerned report painting me as unstable. I did not accuse Marla directly in front of them, not yet, but I let the facts sit in the room like stones. My sister's gaze went to Marla, and Marla's crying slowed, because now she understood this was not only about betrayal, it was about orchestration. Marla tried to deny involvement, saying she didn't know about HR, saying she didn't talk to anyone, saying she never asked for that. The denial came too clean, too fast, and my mother's expression turned colder than I had ever seen it. My mother asked Marla to hand over the bag, calmly, firmly, because it was now part of what she had brought into this house. Marla refused at first, clutching it like a lifeline. My father stood up slowly, and his voice dropped into a tone that did not allow argument. He told Marla to hand over the bag or leave the house immediately. Marla stared at him like she hadn't realized my father could be this direct, and she finally placed the bag on the table with shaking hands. My mother opened it carefully, not rummaging, not tossing things, just looking with the slow attention of a woman who understands that details matter. She pulled out the clinic paper, folded, glossy, and she placed it flat on the table. My sister looked away, unable to take in more. My mother then pulled out something else, something smaller, a business card with a hotel logo and a name printed beneath it, a concierge, a simple piece of paper, and yet it told a story Marla hadn't intended to tell. My father's eyes locked on it, and he asked why she had a concierge card if she only went for dinner. Marla's face went pale again. She said Victor had reserved a room for a meeting, then said she had only stopped by briefly, then said she didn't even go upstairs. 3 answers, collapsing faster now. My father's voice stayed steady, and he asked if she had slept with him at the hotel. Marla tried to deny it, then tried to soften it, then finally broke into sobs and nodded. My sister's chair scraped the floor as she stood abruptly, and she left the dining room without a word, because she couldn't breathe in that space anymore. My mother sat very still, staring at Marla as if seeing a stranger wearing a familiar face. My father looked at me and asked what I planned to do now, and he asked it not as a father ordering a son, but as a man offering a lifeline. I told him I had been collecting proof, because proof was the only thing that would keep Victor from rewriting this into a story where Marla was a brave mother and I was the unstable husband. My mother nodded slowly, and the nod felt like agreement to a plan she hadn't asked for but now understood. She told Marla to leave, and she said it in the same calm voice she used to tell me to go to bed when I was a child, which somehow made it more terrifying. Marla begged then, not for forgiveness, but for time, asking to explain, asking to stay, asking to talk privately. My father shook his head once, and the movement was final. He told her she would not do her damage in this house anymore. Marla looked at me again, eyes wet, face twisted, and she asked if I was really going to do this, if I was really going to let everyone see her like this. I almost smiled because the irony was sharp enough to cut steel. She was the one who chose the stage, and she was shocked to find she didn't control the lighting. Marla gathered her bag, shaking, and headed for the door. My mother followed her, opening it without ceremony. Marla paused at the threshold and said she was pregnant, she was scared, and she didn't know what to do. My mother's voice stayed cold and quiet as she told Marla that fear does not excuse betrayal and that motherhood does not erase cruelty. Marla stepped out into the night, and the door closed behind her with a soft click that felt like a verdict. I stood in the dining room with my parents, the table still set, dessert untouched, and the air thick with what could not be unsaid. My father asked if Victor knew I had found out, and I told him Victor had been trying to shape the story at work, which meant he knew I was a threat. My mother asked what I needed, and I told her I needed witnesses who would remember the truth when the lies started spreading. My mother nodded, and my father nodded, and for the first time in weeks I felt something like support settle under my feet. Then my phone buzzed again, and the screen lit up with a new message preview from Marla's number. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a plea. It was a warning that Victor was furious, that he said I was trying to ruin them, and that he was going to make sure I paid for it. I stared at the message, took the screenshot, and felt the next stage of the war slide into place like a chambered round. Because now it wasn't only a marriage collapsing. Now it was a powerful man realizing the husband he underestimated had witnesses, receipts, and a calm mind that refused to break. I sat in my parents' driveway for a full minute after I left, because my hands stayed too steady for what my mind had just witnessed. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually means safety, but that night it felt like the pause before a verdict. Marla's message glowed on my screen like a flare, all warning and no regret, and I took the screenshot like I was clocking in for a shift. Victor was furious. Victor felt threatened. Victor promised consequences, and none of it sounded like love. It sounded like management. When I finally drove home, the house looked the same from the outside, which felt like a personal insult. The porch light still worked, the curtains still hung in their usual shape, and the mailbox still waited for harmless junk. Inside, the air was stale and strangely tidy, as if Marla had started cleaning before she left, trying to erase her own tracks. I walked through the room slowly, not searching like a desperate husband, but scanning like a man who knows the mess is already documented. My phone buzzed once more with a calendar reminder for my performance alignment meeting, cheerful and corporate, like the system was congratulating itself for being on schedule. I sat at the kitchen table and laid my evidence folder in front of me, because routine keeps you alive when your life turns into a story someone else wants to tell. I opened the folder and reviewed everything with the same dry patience I would use for a broken contract. The HR case reference number sat on top, followed by the screenshot of Victor instructing her to keep me away, followed by the maternity boutique merchant alert, followed by the hotel restaurant charge, followed by the message where she warned me that Victor would make me pay. In the middle, I added a new entry, written cleanly and without emotion. My parents witnessed her admission that the child was Victor's, and my mother held a parking validation slip with matching timestamps. I wrote it as a fact, not as a wound, because wounds invite interpretation and facts do not. At midnight, Marla finally came back, but not the way a wife returns home. I heard her keys scrape the lock, slow and uncertain, like she wasn't sure the door still belonged to her. She stepped inside with her compact bag and her phone clenched in her hand, and the first thing she did was look at my face, not with affection, but with evaluation. She didn't ask how I was, and she didn't apologize for the dinner. She asked what I told them, which was the question of a woman who had lost control of her story and wanted it back. I told her I told them the truth, because the truth was already in the room with us now. She tried to argue, then tried to soften it, then tried to blame my parents for being dramatic, and I watched her cycle through tactics the way a bad salesperson cycles through scripts. When she realized none of it worked, she shifted to the angle Victor would prefer. She said Victor was angry. She said he thought I was trying to sabotage him, and she said I needed to stop before I made things worse. That last sentence was the tell, because it assumed I was the one escalating, not the one responding to betrayal and workplace framing. I asked her a simple question, and I asked it calmly enough to make her flinch. I asked whether she told Victor about my HR meeting and whether she told him I was collecting proof. Marla hesitated, and the hesitation lived in her throat like a swallowed stone. She said she didn't want to answer, then said she didn't remember, then said she only mentioned it because she was scared. 3 answers again, falling apart under their own weight. I nodded once and told her I didn't need more explanation tonight, because explanation was not evidence and I was done collecting feelings. Marla tried another move, the move where she cast herself as fragile. She said she was pregnant and stressed, and she said she couldn't handle conflict, and she said she needed stability. Stability. The word she loved, the word Victor sold her like a product. I told her stability doesn't come from lying, and that pregnancy doesn't erase choice, and that if she wanted stability, she shouldn't have built a life on secrets. She stared at me like she expected anger, expected shouting, expected me to finally perform the role she and Victor had written for me. When I didn't, her face tightened with something close to fear. She went to the bedroom and started pulling out clothes, moving fast, more frantic than organized. Suitcases came out again like they lived in the closet permanently now, waiting for the next lie. She said she needed to stay with a friend for a while, and she said it like she was offering me mercy. I asked which friend, and she refused to answer. I didn't push, because pushing would give her a reason to say I was controlling. I simply told her she could go, and that I wanted everything documented and clean, because if she left with her choices, not with my property, not with my name, and not with a story that made me look dangerous. As she packed, her phone rang, and she stepped into the hallway to take it. She tried to speak quietly, but the walls in a small house don't respect secrets. I heard Victor's name in her tone, heard the sharpness, heard the urgency. I heard her say she couldn't calm me down because I wasn't reacting, and she sounded almost angry about it, as if my composure was a personal betrayal to her new plan. Victor said something I couldn't hear, and Marla answered that she would handle it, and that she would make sure I didn't do anything at work. The line hit me like ice water, because it wasn't about saving the marriage at all. It was about containing me inside an institutional box. When she ended the call, she came back into the bedroom and found me standing by the door, not blocking her, just present. She asked if I had been listening, and I told her I heard enough. She tried to accuse me of eavesdropping, and the sarcasm almost escaped my mouth. This was the woman who slept beside me while planning a new family with my boss, and she wanted to lecture me about boundaries. I told her she could take her suitcases and leave, but she should understand something first. I told her if Victor wanted a quiet war, then he should have chosen a quieter opponent. The next morning, I went to work early, because early hours belong to people who plan. The building smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner, and the lobby security guard greeted me with a smile that was slightly uncertain. The uncertainty told me a rumor had already started moving, carried by polite whispers and concern language. I returned the greeting, walked calmly to my desk, and started preparing the only weapon that matters in a corporate environment. A clean, boring, documented packet. I didn't write a dramatic statement, and I didn't accuse anyone of grand conspiracies. I wrote a timeline with dates, times, and the exact language used in the HR meeting. I included the reference code they had given me. I included the screenshot of Victor's message instructing Marla to keep me away, the screenshot of the threat that he would make me pay, and the merchant alert evidence that placed her at the hotel during the time she claimed an off-site. I added a short summary line for each item, written like a man who expects his words to be read aloud in a neutral room. I did not include my pain, because pain is irrelevant to policy. At 10, my manager stopped by my desk and asked if I had a minute, and he asked it with the careful tone of a man trying not to look afraid. He walked me to a small conference room and closed the door gently, like he was trying not to startle an animal. He said HR wanted to keep my alignment meeting as scheduled, and he said there had been some concern about tension in my personal life. The concern phrase again, delivered like a sedative. I asked him whether the concern involved Victor, and my manager's eyes flicked away for a fraction of a second. That was all I needed, because people don't look away from names unless names have power. I told my manager I intended to attend the meeting, and I intended to bring documentation, because I would not be framed as unstable, while my boss used my marriage as a playground. My manager's face tightened, and he warned me to keep it professional. I nodded and told him that professional was my only setting, which was true, and also a warning. The real risk wasn't me raising my voice. The real risk was the record I was about to create. At lunch, I received a message from an unknown number, short and sharp, with the kind of arrogance that always thinks it is invisible. The message said I should stop before I embarrass myself, and that I would lose everything if I pushed this. It didn't sign a name, but it didn't need to. Victor's confidence had a signature, and it always smelled like entitlement. I took the screenshot anyway, because intimidation is still a form of evidence when it happens in writing. Then I forwarded it to myself and noted the time, because the timeline was becoming a chain, and chains are hard to break. In the afternoon, HR sent a brief email confirming the performance alignment meeting, including the location, attendees, and time. I saved the email with headers visible, because email headers are the closest thing corporate people have to fingerprints. The meeting would include the HR director from my earlier check-in, the employee relations specialist, my manager, and Victor. Victor would be in the room. Victor would be under policy constraints. Victor would be expecting me to either beg or explode. Neither was going to happen. When I got home that evening, Marla was gone. The closet had an empty stretch where her clothes used to hang, and the bathroom cabinet looked stripped, like she had removed the evidence of her own daily life. On the counter, she left a note, short, neat, and infuriatingly calm. It said she needed space, she needed peace, and she hoped I would be reasonable. Reasonable. The word people use when they mean compliant. I took a photo of the note, added it to the ledger, and filed it under narrative building, because that was exactly what it was. I spent the night preparing the packet in final form, printing one copy for HR and one copy for myself. I placed each page into a clear sleeve, labeled with date and time, because presentation matters when your enemy believes he owns the room. I slept in short bursts, not because I was afraid, but because my mind kept running through possible angles Victor might try. He would claim I was harassing him, or that I was obsessed, or that I was retaliating against a superior. He would try to flip the story so I looked like the aggressor. That meant my packet needed to show one thing clearly. I had been responding to a coordinated attempt to pre-frame me, and I had been documenting calmly while they escalated. By morning, I had reached a kind of cold clarity that felt almost peaceful. Marla had chosen her side, and Victor had chosen his tactics, and the company had chosen to play referee without admitting it. The alignment meeting wasn't just a meeting anymore. It was the public arena Victor couldn't fully control because HR loves policy more than it loves powerful men when the proof is neat. All I had to do was walk in, keep my voice steady, and let the documents do the talking. I placed the evidence sleeves into a plain folder, the most boring container I could find, because boring is camouflage in places built for performance. Then I checked the calendar one last time, looked at the meeting time, and felt the sarcasm settle into my chest like a quiet laugh. Victor wanted me to pay, and he thought he could bill me through fear. Tomorrow, he was going to learn what happens when the bill comes with receipts and an audience. The next day, I arrived 30 minutes early, because timing is a kind of discipline. The HR floor was quiet, carpeted, and built to soften voices into compliance. I carried my plain folder like it was nothing, because anything that looks important becomes a target. The receptionist smiled too brightly and told me to wait, and I could see the question behind her eyes. She had heard something, but she didn't know what to call it yet. When the door finally opened, my manager stepped out first, jaw tight, hands empty. Behind him came the employee relations specialist from my earlier check-in, holding a tablet like a shield. Victor appeared last, perfectly dressed, perfectly calm, and perfectly annoyed to be sharing oxygen with me. His expression said I was an inconvenience that had outlived its usefulness. If arrogance had a uniform, he wore it well. They led us into a small conference room with glass walls and a table that felt too narrow. There was a screen mounted at one end, and the employee relations specialist connected her tablet. I noticed a document window already open on the screen titled Meeting Notes, with a date and time. That detail mattered more than any insult Victor could throw because it meant this would be recorded in real time. Victor noticed it too, and his eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before he fixed his smile again. The HR director arrived, introduced herself, and began with the same careful language as before. She said the goal was alignment, professionalism, and clarity around conduct expectations. She said the company took all concerns seriously and wanted a respectful process. Victor nodded as if he owned the word respectful, and my manager stared at the table like he wished the wood could swallow him. I sat with my shoulders relaxed and my hands still, because stillness makes other people talk. Victor spoke first, because men like him always believe the room belongs to them. He said he was concerned about my recent behavior, and he said he wanted to ensure team stability. He mentioned tension, mentioned boundaries, mentioned the need for me to focus on my work. He didn't mention my name like a human name. He mentioned it like a risk label. I let him finish without interrupting, because interruptions look emotional, and I wasn't there to perform emotion for his benefit. When he stopped, the HR director asked if I wanted to respond. I did not respond with a speech, because speeches are easy to dismiss. I responded with process. I placed the folder on the table, opened it slowly, and slid a single sheet forward first, a clean timeline with dates and brief lines of fact. I told them I would keep this professional, and I would keep it documented, because the company deserved clarity. Victor's smile tightened, but he still looked confident, like he expected my documents to be weak. I started with the HR reference number from the first meeting and asked the employee relations specialist to confirm it on record. She did, and she typed it into the meeting notes on the screen. Seeing the code appear in live text changed the air in the room. It took the story out of Victor's mouth and placed it into institutional memory. Victor shifted in his chair, a small movement, but it was the first sign of discomfort. Then I slid forward the screenshot of the message preview that had appeared on our shared tablet, showing Victor's name and the phrase "keep him away." I did not call it a confession, I called it a record of what appeared on a shared household device, visible to me lawfully, and saved immediately. I told HR I was not asking them to judge my marriage, and I was asking them to see the pattern. I was being framed as unstable while my direct superior communicated about isolating me through my spouse. Victor tried to laugh, a small, controlled laugh, and said it was absurd. He said anyone could create a screenshot, and he said personal messages weren't the company's concern. The HR director didn't argue with him because arguing gives him a stage. She asked one question instead, quiet and surgical. She asked why his name would appear on my household device at all, and whether he had been contacting my spouse outside professional necessity. Victor's mouth opened, then closed, and his confidence cracked just enough to show something sharp underneath. I slid the next page forward. The message Marla sent me after leaving my parents' house, warning me that Victor was furious and would make sure I paid. I framed it the same way, as a saved record, time-stamped, and kept on my device. I told HR this message came after a family dinner where my spouse admitted she was pregnant by Victor and planned to leave me. I watched my manager's face drain of color because he hadn't expected the room to get this real. The HR director didn't blink, but the employee relations specialist paused her typing for one heartbeat before continuing. Victor leaned forward and said this was personal, inappropriate, and defamatory. He said I was trying to weaponize domestic conflict against him professionally. He said my performance had been slipping, and this was retaliation. He said the company should not reward a disgruntled employee's vendetta. The word disgruntled was his favorite tool because it makes a man sound irrational without proving anything. I let him finish again, then slid forward the piece that made his throat tighten. It was the merchant alert screenshot, showing the hotel restaurant charge on a shared account, time-stamped during the window Marla claimed an offsite. I did not accuse him of anything physical in that room, because physical details are easy to turn into scandal smoke. I kept it on the level HR understands: conflict of interest, misuse of authority, and retaliatory framing. I asked HR one simple question, and I asked it without heat. I asked whether it was appropriate for a supervisor to engage in a relationship with an employee's spouse, then allow a concern report to be filed that paints the employee as unstable. Victor's hands tightened on the table edge, and the skin around his eyes hardened. He said he had no control over what Marla did, and he said he never asked anyone to file a report. He said he didn't even know about the report until now, and he said he had been trying to help me by keeping things calm. Help. The word came out like a joke that expected applause. The HR director didn't react emotionally, but she glanced at the employee relations specialist, and the specialist scrolled on her tablet. I saw a quick flicker of recognition pass between them, the look people share when a lie hits a known record. The HR director asked Victor to step back from general statements and answer a direct compliance question. She asked whether he had contacted my spouse during work hours about my employment situation and whether he had used any company channels to influence how I was perceived. Victor started to deflect again, but the HR director cut through him with another quiet request. She asked him to confirm, on record, whether he had ever advised my spouse to keep me away from certain settings or people at work. The screen showed the meeting notes line waiting like a blank check. Victor hesitated, and that hesitation was louder than any denial. He tried to reframe it as a misunderstanding, then tried to call it a joke, then tried to say he meant keep me away from stress. 3 answers, just like Marla. It almost made me smile because patterns have families, and liars tend to share the same DNA. The HR director nodded once and typed a short line into the notes. Inconsistency noted. That one phrase landed like a nail. Then I placed the final page on the table. Not dramatic, just decisive. It was a printed copy of the unknown number threat message telling me to stop before I embarrass myself. I didn't claim it was Victor, because claims invite debate. I stated that it arrived after my manager pulled me into a private room to discuss concerns, and that it aligned with the language of intimidation. The HR director asked Victor if he recognized the number or the message. Victor's face shifted, and he said no too quickly, the way people say no when they want to end a topic immediately. The HR director closed her folder, looked at Victor, and said the company was opening a formal investigation into potential retaliation, conflict of interest, and abuse of position. She said, effective immediately, Victor was being placed on administrative leave pending review. She said he was to have no contact with me, no contact with my spouse through company channels, and no involvement in any decisions affecting my role. The employee relations specialist typed while she spoke, and the words appeared on the screen like a public stamp. Victor stood up too fast, and his chair scraped the floor with a harsh sound that felt like the first real noise he had made all meeting. He said this was outrageous, and he said he would fight it, and he said I had no idea who I was messing with. The HR director didn't raise her voice. She simply repeated that the instruction was clear, and that any further escalation would be documented as well. My manager looked relieved and terrified at the same time, like a man watching a building collapse while being grateful he wasn't under it. Victor glared at me, but the glare had lost its power. He wasn't staring at a husband anymore. He was staring at a record he couldn't erase, typed live in a room he didn't control. He grabbed his jacket, muttered something about lawyers, and headed for the door. The HR director asked him to leave his badge on the table, and the request was simple enough to feel like a verdict. Victor paused, jaw clenched, then dropped the badge with a sharp click that echoed in the small room. I didn't celebrate, because celebration looks petty and invites revenge. I simply gathered my folder, nodded to HR, and said I would cooperate fully, and I expected protection from retaliation. The HR director agreed, and she said it clearly, so it would sit in the notes with everything else. As I stood, I realized my hands were still steady, and the steadiness felt like the only victory that mattered. Victor walked out first, carrying his rage like luggage, and the door closed behind him. The screen still showed the meeting notes, with the last line typed in plain black text: administrative leave initiated, evidence received, investigation opened. I looked at that line, then looked at the empty seat where Victor had been, and I understood the cleanest truth of all. He tried to make me pay, and I handed the invoice to the only institution he couldn't charm.